מתחזקת הערכה שהמלחמה הבאה בזירה הצפונית תהיה שונה מהמלחמות המוכרות לנו. כבר לא מלחמה של צבאות השועטים מהגבולות, אלא מתקפה של עשרות אלפי טילים על העורף וכלי טייס בלתי מאוישים שיכוונו לתוך ישראל. השינוי העיקרי במערכה הצפויה נובע ממעורבותה של איראן ומהתחזקותו של הציר השיעי בהובלתה. איראן מנצלת את המלחמה בסוריה לקדם את שאיפתה להגמוניה אזורית על ידי פריסת צבאות הפרוקסי שלה לשם יצירת מסדרון יבשתי מטהרן דרך עיראק, סוריה ולבנון. בכך, איראן פועלת לקצר זמנים וטווחים לפגיעה בישראל. מנגד, ישראל מצליחה לסכל מאמצים אלה, אם כי רק באופן חלקי, על ידי האסטרטגיה של המערכה בין המלחמות, המכונה מב"ם. לאור זאת, ישראל נערכת לתרחיש החמור ביותר במלחמה הבאה, שעלול לכלול בו זמנית מתקפת טילים מלבנון מצד חיזבאללה, המהווה כיום את האיום הצבאי העיקרי על ישראל. שיגור טילים ארוכי טווח וכטב"מים תוקפים על ישראל בהנחיה איראנית, מסוריה, מעיראק ומאיראן עצמה. ניסיונות חדירה קרקעיים מלבנון של כוחות חיזבאללה במטרה להשתלט על יישובים ועל מוצבים של צה"ל, ובמקביל ניסיונות חדירה של מיליציות שיעיות מסוריה לרמת הגולן. ירי טילים וניסיונות חדירה מעזה של הג'יהאד האסלאמי וייתכן גם חמאס. מתקפת סייבר לשיבוש מערכות תשתית לאומיות. תגובתה של ישראל לתרחיש זה תהיה קשה וכואבת, וצפויים פגיעה והרס משמעותיים, ובמיוחד למדינה הלבנונית.
Good evening. Our war games deal with the changes in the geopolitical reality in our surroundings, and specifically on the battleground. We're talking about Syria, Russian presence there, American presence in the Middle East, what's happening with Iran, and their support of the Hezbollah, and the assassination of Soleimani, and maybe even the deal of the century. All of these things combined. So, we are on the second stage of a game that began this morning. We're in a closed forum in the INSS with the players and a couple of work groups that we were with, and now we're at the second phase that has to do with the results or outcomes of the first phase, which relates to a war in the north. And finally, we'll talk about the insights that have been learned throughout the game. So I'm gonna present Nitsan Alon was head of operations, commander of the Central Command in 2018, was appointed by the General Chief of Staff, Eisenkot, to deal with the Iranian threat. He's playing Israel. General Joseph Votel, a four-star retired general, and was the head of CENTCOM in the United States, and now he's commanded the coalition that fought the Islamic State, so there's nobody better to be the United States. Igor Yurgens has been in many serious senior positions. He was a member of the board of Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. He, and among many other things, he's going to represent Russia. Shimrit Meir is a journalist and a correspondent on the Middle East. She has Twitter account over 60,000 followers. She is playing Iran. And General John Alon, a Marines general, is now president of the Brun Institute. He fought in Afghanistan, a special attaché of the military attaché of President Obama. In any case, too many things to say for his CV. He's going to be Syria. And Orna Mizrahi, a senior researcher in the INSS, who has a long career in various positions. Recently, she was vice director for foreign affairs, and she in this game is going to be representing the Hezbollah. I am going to present in a couple of words the outline of this war game, of the scenario. Events happened began last night at around 8 p.m. Israel attacked on the basis of a good intel on an attempt of Iranians to transfer weapons to Syria, and which had to do with the precision. And as a result of this attack, 7 people were killed, 4 Iranians of the Quds, and 5 and a few Hezbollah members. The Hezbollah decided to react to this. Iran, through their Quds forces, sent missiles from Syria to Israeli territories, and the Hezbollah sent an anti-tank missile to a vehicle in Israeli territory. And because of these actions, 3 Israelis were killed, 2 civilians because of the Quds missile, and 1 soldier was also killed. And as a result, towards midnight, the state of Israel decided on a broad strike against 25 Iranian targets in Syria. As a result of that attack, 15 Iranians, 3 Hezbollah members, and 3 Syrian Quds members were killed, and very irregularly it also openly attacked in Lebanon. 3 sites are precision targets in which 10 Hezbollah agents were killed and 2 Lebanese civilians. So we had a very tense night, as you can imagine, and at the end of that night, in the following morning, Hezbollah has sent dozens of missiles into Israeli territories, some of them precision capable, and 6 Israeli civilians were killed. And the attack on the north concurrently, Radwan forces, the Hezbollah Radwan forces tried to infiltrate to the north of Israel. Apparently they were stopped. Generally speaking, they were stopped. It may be that we have several foreign agents within our territories, and additionally a Shiite militia from Syria sent missiles to Israel, but no one was killed. So the scenario, which is the basis for this war game, ends with 3 significant events this morning. In the early morning hours, Israel attacks a very large number, dozens in fact, of targets in Lebanon and Syria. We have yet to know the number of fatalities and casualties, but there are dozens in those 2 countries. The Syrian army, which has up until now been out of the picture, has now raised its level of alertness. And the Shiite Iraqi militia has done 2 things: sent missiles to Israel, but they have no fatalities or casualties. But the American base in Iraq kills 5 are killed, and they describe this concurrent attack as something that has to do with retaliation over the death of Soleimani. Okay, so that's the beginning premise, and now we want to understand the stances of the various actors. We have basically 3 arenas of action, and also in Israel we have the Hezbollah, we have Israel against Iran and Syria, and we have Iraqis being active and fighting and attacking American and Israeli targets. Okay, so I'm going to start with Shimrit, with the Iranians. In this event, a couple of dozen Iranians were killed. Israel broadly attacked Iranian targets in Syria. And the thing that we should ask, or I believe should ask from an Iranian point of view, is this an inevitable war? I mean, how can you manage the radical Shiite forces in these days of escalation? How can you do it without Soleimani, who organized this activity? And if you are going to war, what kind of war do you propose? Well, first of all, there's a conservative scenario, which is more conceivable, and a more radical one, because we live in a very tense time, tense internally and externally. And one has to understand that the assassination of Soleimani and the very weak Iranian response were noted in the regional arena. It sounded like it's a bit, a sour note with the people who are opposing it, but also among the enemies of Iran. And Trump himself said that this is, they reacted weakly. We all understand that. Now, in order to truly comprehend this very tense Iranian scenario, let's begin with the first conservative option, okay? And it does have a couple of principles. First of all, the Iranians are going to distance this event from Iran itself, meaning into the periphery, when there are all sorts of options of how to do it. Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. I think the most reasonable thing for us, or at least the group that was considering this, is Syria. Syria for two reasons, really. First of all, Syria has a mechanism of de-escalation through the Russians. The Russians are there, and they don't want to imperil the Bashar regime, and so the Russians have a clear interest in order to help contain the situation and get the Iranians out of any loop. Second, in Syria there is no public opinion, unlike Iraq. And unlike Lebanon, which is very adversarial at this point, Syrians have seen everything, and this is for them just another event in a whole series of events. So I think that if the Iranians take it into the Syrian arena, then this would be an escalation in that sense. So a second principle is the empowerment of Nasrallah. Without Soleimani, they have a toolkit that they've been working on for years, but there's no maestro, no someone to lead this symphony. So the was the only person that they had is of course a big player in and of himself, but they are going to try to use the help of as a consultant maybe, and also to keep him close. Not allow any kind of space to occur between the two of them. And a third point is to get the United States out of the story, not repeat the story, the problem of the embassy and what happened with Soleimani. First of all, because they want to function in a relatively predictable fashion. So in that sense, we can expect that the next Iranian maneuver will be some kind of retaliation through some kind of proxy in Syria, and using the de-escalation factor of the Russians with the help of a couple of other minor players. But I would, and that was something that we talked about in the group, I would like to talk about another scenario, which is maybe a bit more radical, because in this scenario, the conventional wisdom, at least within the Israeli system, is that the Iranians are keeping the missile capability of the Syrians for the day that they need it, meaning the moment that they will require it. And the question is, haven't we already begun the series of steps that would force Iran to take that more radical options in light of the internal problems that they have, the domestic pressures that they're dealing with? I mean, this is the first question. Has the day arrived? Another thing that we have to think about is public opinion, because they are supposed to manage this campaign on several fronts, where every one of these proxies has their own interest, but also internally, domestically, they have their own turmoil in their country. So their motivation to save face is just going to increase, particularly now that Soleimani is dead. Okay, finally, the assessment, I mean, what happens in this scenario, it's not only a question of the missile capabilities, but for example, in this scenario, there's a Radwan, a militia force trying to infiltrate Israel and failing, right? So it may be that the action will shift from Syria to Lebanon, and then they'll say, maybe we can try this again, another kind of type of infiltration to show that's, I don't know, another action against Israel. So the Iranians don't want broad-scale escalation, but you may be contemplating a bigger, worse scenario. But Israel has already targeted over 25, we said, targets, and there's been a very broad response. You tried to infiltrate, missiles, and so forth. But the question is, I'm asking you, Orna, I mean, for you, is this an inevitable war? Is war the only thing that's going to happen? Is there anything that will stop it? And if so, if there will be a war, what kind of war? And finally, to what degree are you sort of tense, waiting for the Iranian command not to react, versus what we saw this morning and what Israel did? Well, what happened this morning was very interesting, actually, because Iran was Iran, restrained the Hezbollah. Okay, but let me just explain the logic of the Hezbollah after these events that you've described. Okay, at the moment in which the Hezbollah, on the one hand, responded to the Israeli attack, initiated by Israel, and it has quite a few accomplishments to its name: precision, missile capability, we can, they can write these accomplishments to their names. On the other hand, Israel are still the one who did the last act, and therefore there's a real dilemma here, or a difficult dilemma of, are you going to decide that at this time you're stopping, or still, wait, how do they stop? What do you mean stop? Well, that's a question. How do you stop? It relates to how Israel decides to react, because it takes two to tango, right? But let's say that if they stop at this point, if he stops at this point, and Israel decides that enough is enough, then maybe there's room for closure here. I don't know, possibly. But the second possibility, and here I think the second possibility is more reasonable to accept, is that the Hezbollah must react, because there was a precedent here, Israel attacking within Lebanon, something that Israel hasn't done since '06, and two attacks by Israel, only one of them was responded to. This can't be left as it is, and the Hezbollah has to react. Consequently, on the other hand, we have to say, and we're not living in a vacuum, that overall the Hezbollah in the last period of time has dealt with a whole list of restrictions and limitations that have impacted its operations, and their basic interests are like Iran in the war, but Iran doesn't want a broad, all-encompassing war. And so what we've understood, and I hope that we have time to talk about all of the limitations on Hezbollah, but I don't have time to detail them, but at least maybe I'll list the important ones. Limitations or restrictions of what's happening within Lebanon, the protests in Lebanon, the budgetary problems, the sanctions on the Hezbollah itself, what's happening between the Hezbollah and the Lebanese population, and also the very uncomfortable situation of Iran and the tension versus the United States. I mean, the U.S., nobody knows how they're going to react, and as we've seen from the Americans lately, relatively rationally so far in the last period. But this is also, by the way, an opportunity to stop for a second and thank my team. But we came to the conclusion that what the Hezbollah will do, that the Hezbollah will react and will do something, but we talked about something that is more maybe contained, some kind of attack on the north, military targets primarily, meaning the Hezbollah will not open itself up to full retaliation by the state of Israel as yet. You mean they won't go for Israeli civilian targets? No, but now, in order to create some kind of closure, then maybe they will go for a contained target, a military target in the north of Israel, and then the Hezbollah can say that they had the last word. And thus they would have, they establish rules of the game by which Israel always gets a reaction by the Hezbollah for everything that they do. Wait. So, okay, let me understand. The Hezbollah also doesn't want an all-out war, an all-scale war, even though we're at the brink of that war? But they're trying to close this event. Yes, but the Hezbollah also take the possibility, accept the risks. At least in the September events, we saw they took they accepted the risk that they may escalate to an all-out war. So they're taking on that risk now as well, in a sense. Okay, I turn to you now, so we can. Let's talk about the radical Shiite attitude. Everybody's talking about Syria. Everybody's present in Syria. Are there any ways in order to implement its own strategy, Syria? Any way that they can turn against Iran, against the Hezbollah? How do they even address this campaign where the Hezbollah and Iran are all operating on Syrian ground? Okay, this is a different kind of conflict. Okay, this is I turn now to the Israelis, to Nitsan. Israel had a kind of reasoning up until now, but now you're at a crossroads. It seems that the radical Shiites are trying not to escalate the situation. Can Israel find some kind of opportunity here? Maybe is this the time to act against the Iranians in Syria, to get the Iranians out of Syria? Is this the time to strike hard against the Hezbollah? Okay, we had those thoughts, we thought those thoughts, but if we stop for a moment to see what Israel has done, this is an initiated strike which has expanded the campaign, the war between wars. The president, of course, is the fact that there have been open attacks against those precision targets. And this relates to our relationship with Hezbollah and Nasrallah, and we know the price for these actions. And yet, the situation as it stands is that Israel sees that there are strategic conditions that will allow for promoting our security interests, those same security interests that, such as stopping the continued precision capabilities, the advancement of precision capabilities of our enemies, and the key conditions also that would allow for that kind of advancement. So we have the full American support for our actions, and the contention between Iran and the U.S. aligns Israeli interests with American interests, up to the point of having a campaign together, of going to war together, to the point that we and the Americans can agree certainly on the boundaries of this cooperation. Of course, there are the sort of traditional means like the ballistic missile defense program, which is an obvious, well-known one. But there are other back channels in which we and the Americans work together. But Iran is under a lot of pressure. They have enormous economic pressure, obviously. The assassination of Soleimani certainly demonstrated the difficulty of knowing what the Americans would do, and if there's something the Iranians don't want is a war in Iran, and they certainly don't want a war in Iran with the Americans, so against the Americans. So, and the political crisis in Lebanon, the sensitivity of Hezbollah and Nasrallah personally, by the way, to the Lebanese public opinion is certainly a restraining factor, a significant one. And in Syria, I don't have to say what John Allen said, I mean, very clearly, excellently. Bashar Assad is still fighting to maintain his regime. Syria is still bleeding and battered. So we are in a situation by which Israel has an opportunity to expand the campaign to promote our interests, even at the price of maybe regional or local escalation, maybe even at the price of taking on, such strikes against us, or infiltration attempts. You have to understand that when Israel initiates such a strike, it of course thinks several steps ahead and prepares for the potential repercussions and reactions and counter-reactions. And of course we have our air defense in place, we have our attack capabilities in prepared status. This is not routine, certainly. So Israel can take on the risk and accept the risk to push forward for our interests, while being prepared that it may escalate and that the escalation may spin out of control. That is a risk, it's a calculated risk, but with the conditions that I've mentioned versus the potential for reaching our goals, it's a payoff, it's a good payoff. So wait a second, what you're saying is conducive to what, Hezbollah are saying as well, in a sense that apart from the initial escalation, not the Great War, just some kind of broad escalation that we could maybe assume will be contained. Is that what Israel is trying to do? I remind you, meaning this is not the campaign between campaigns or the war between words or something else. It's an extension of that idea of a campaign between campaigns, meaning you bring yourself to the brink of war, not on the brink of regional escalation, but so we're talking about broad escalation versus war. Look, I agree that there is a risk, and there are random or incidental factors involved that the political echelon can't control. But I believe that we're very experienced, and the strategic factors are, in balance. There's also another issue, by the way, that has to do with the multi-arena battleground. Does the government of Israel have an interest to exploit this opportunity in regards to the Palestinians. Also, there's a great sensitivity and volatility on the Palestinian front at the moment. That's certainly not encouraging us to go and try to, go to war. No. So we're looking at, okay, from here to Russia and the US, I turn to you. Russia sees, does Russia see an opportunity in this escalation, or does Russia just want to stop this escalation as fast as possible? How can you protect this asset that you have built up in Syria and everything that's happened thus far? Last, General Votel, the US. You have a specific problem in Iraq. Your military people have been killed, Iraqi militia has attacked you, but there's also regional escalation between Israel, Hezbollah, Iran. What's going to be the American policy? Will the US find some kind of opportunity in this escalation, or will the US want to shut this down as quickly as possible? Is there any idea to take this as an opportunity against Iran, maybe?
This is the situation that's been created is quite fascinating because in contrast to intuition, contrary to intuition and what was published as the estimate of the Intel Directorate about 7 to 10 days ago, and also in contrast to the strategic assessment of the INSS, is what comes up here is that the power of the harnessing, the limiting elements is very strong. Everybody wants this not to go out of control, and we'll talk about that later in the commander's debriefing. But why don't we try and take it to a more advanced place if we're talking about the level of escalation? Israel analyzed the situation and said, I have a freedom of action here, a certain space within which I can operate. Hopefully it won't go out of control, but I do understand that it might spin out of control, and that was also your conclusion in the radical axis. So let's say that something went wrong, something in what you did, Hezbollah, had harmed more Israelis than you thought would be harmed, and maybe the action taken by Israelis had hit more Lebanese and people from the Quds Force and Syrians than planned. So we are now in a situation that has been that's more escalated than our game here. We're not going to describe it accurately, but let's hear from the combating elements what is their preferable war. We're going to take a broader escalation than the one that was played out here. Is it only in Lebanon? Is it in multi-theaters? And is it Russia and the US and perhaps even Syria, assuming that it won't participate? Maybe it will participate. It's a very interesting question. Is there a situation in which the Syrian military enters this campaign actively? How do we turn this off? Can the international system help in taking down a broader escalation, putting it out? So, Orna, what is your preferable war when we talk about a broader escalation? But I'd like to make a comment, Itai. We did this game under lab conditions. We're holding it under lab conditions. At this point in time, Hezbollah and Iran probably won't initiate a war unless there will be an Israeli initiative. But there is a lot of room for miscalculation, for mistakes, for escalations. This is why the war scenario is a scenario that we need to deal with and pay attention to. So if we're talking about what Hezbollah will want to do, how it will want this war to look like. First of all, it won't want this war to be the third Lebanon war. They won't want to be the only ones involved. It will be very important for Hezbollah to expand the boundaries of this campaign and to fight in as many theaters as possible. First of all, in order to split up Israel's attention, the IDF's attention, and also to try and reduce potential damage for Hezbollah and Lebanon. So what will it do? Will it use forces from Syria? Yes, it can operate from Lebanon and Syria, and it will do whatever it can from Syria as well, and it will put as much pressure as it can on the Iranians to do their share in the other theaters with perhaps missiles from Iraq. And what's the purpose of this war from the Hezbollah perspective? To significantly weaken Israel, to show the capabilities and power of the Axis, and to significantly harm Israel. It will use all the firepower it has, and I believe it will try some kind of a ground maneuver within this lengthy and complex campaign. And even though it did fail according to your scenario, it will try to do that as well. And we mustn't forget the element of surprises. I guess there are a few things we haven't thought about. You still have some time to think about a surprise. Shimrit, Iran. What kind of war does Iran prefer? Well, of course, if we're talking about a short scenario, it's with Syria. If it's a longer scenario, they'll probably pushed out of Syria by the Russians, and probably Iraq is bringing them too close to the fingers of the Americans. So this is why we're talking about Lebanon. And under such a scenario, one can estimate that they will have a 1 week Hezbollah blitz, and they're going to try to make lemonades out of these lemons to improve the power of deterrence of the entire axis, to have a major scale attack of Hezbollah and Iran, and maybe we'll even see some missiles moving there, maybe, you know, some aerial defense preparedness. Iran, do you see an option of Iran launching missiles from its territory towards Israel? I think it will be a very risky measure, maybe at the end of the campaign, but I believe that what they'll want to do is a kind of a show of their capabilities throughout this week that will make all the other regionals lose any desire to mess with them again, to improve their deterrence and to have some kind of a mindset victory and empowerment of the Axis, to kind of stick a flag of ground forces of Hezbollah. That could be an excellent scenario to conquer certain strategic targets in Israel, and even within this framework they'll want to finish it within a period of 7 to 10 days. And you see something that its fulcrum is in Lebanon, additional theaters, Yemen, Iraq, encouraging the elements that you know how to guide in Gaza. Look, Gaza it can be a sidekick, but not the main dish. And you know, in all the other arenas, you're dealing with something that doesn't give you enough firepower, and it gets too close to the Americans. You want to separate them from Israel and from this entire situation. So if you wanted to regain Iranian deterrence that's being eroded on the regional level, then you use whatever you can use. And in this respect, Nasrallah can be something that you don't even need to push, but simply you don't need to put any brakes on it. General Alon, is there a situation in which the Syrian military, the Syrian regime, takes an active part in this kind of multi-theater war on the one hand, and what is the point in which you do something perhaps active vis-a-vis the Iranians to tell them, go away, we don't like this, the way that you operate from our territory? I'd like to go back to you, Nitsan, regarding the questions from before, and the same questions as before. Under these circumstances, to where do we expand or reduce the boundaries of this war? And can we think about the Iranian story once again? I think that beyond a certain threshold, I mean, you know, shit happens, you know, in these kind of military events. So if something has happened that had led us to a significant escalation, then the firepower coming from Lebanon and in other aspects will no longer make it possible to stop at something that's only, you know, half a measure. So I think that at a certain point, not that far from where we were before, we're already entering a campaign. I think that the significance is that it will last more than a week, and if it's a significant measure that also includes harm, maybe collateral damage, but very significant damage to the infrastructure of the Lebanese state, and it also has a positive effect of a long-term deterrence ultimately in order to clarify the cost of hosting Hezbollah. What about Syria? I find it difficult to see how operationally the Syrian aerial defense systems remain intact in such a situation. Probably they'll enter a certain threat, they'll lock onto airplanes, interfere with various reconnaissance activities. Still, it doesn't mean that we're going in and we have an ability to convey direct strategic messages to Bashar al-Assad through the Russians as well. I don't think that we have to reach a situation that a Syrian Scud is launched by Syria at Israel. But if so, then all in all, the assaultive capabilities of Israel enable it to maintain a northern campaign without harming the effort against Hezbollah. And it's not just what you do during the war and what conditions are created. It's important what conditions are being created to prevent further armament. And maybe that's the question: what's the purpose of this war for Israel? Okay, so we find ourselves in war, and as long as we're in war, we need to significantly damage the missiles and the precision project in Syria. And just as important is to create the conditions to use the situation that there are Russians in Syria and that the Americans are more actively involved in the area, and the Iranian interests that will not enable the renewal as had happened after Second Lebanon War and afterwards and before it. And now under this situation of a broad escalation, the question is, what are the capabilities of the international system to help in the efforts of de-escalation? So Russia and then the US, how do we stop it? And what is the true power today vis-a-vis the elements that are fighting in the Middle East? Igor.
Thank you to all the participants. I now hand the mic over to Udi. I think that what we saw is a fantastic force of restraint here. The question is, did the actors really use the restraining forces to their benefit? Well, we are now in the commander's debriefing, but I am going to direct it so that we don't repeat things that have been said. There are two people who are very significant. General Petraeus, you know him. He's been a friend of ours for many years. He was director of the CIA. He was commander of CENTCOM. He sent CENTCOM about the American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. This man knows the situation. We have Gadi Eisenkot, very familiar figure as well. IDF Chief of General Staff. By the way, during his term, I mean, we termed it the Eisenkot term, but this campaign between campaigns, coming only to the brink of war. But I want to talk to you, General Petraeus, first, if I may. All of these restraining forces, they're overly rational and weak, frail, limp. What has changed? When you were head of the CIA and an assumption was that the events that we're describing now, including also the assassination of Soleimani, would bring about a regional war. What happened? What changed? Nobody wants to fight? we saw in this game that the people managed to contain the situation. There's a saying that we always say, that escalation has a dynamic of its own, right? Now let's play the game and imagine that there was greater escalation that we've seen thus far, bigger escalation, okay? When is Israel supposed to make the decision that Israel is no longer dealing with Iranian proxies, but rather dealing with Iran itself? Commander, have I sort of given you an uncomfortable question? No, when we deal with the problems, with the threats facing the state of Israel, we've dealt with worse than the Hezbollah and Shiite militias and Quds forces in Syria. Because at the end of the day, the Iranian ability to harm Israel is significantly smaller than the ability existing in Lebanon, where there's 150,000 missiles right here, and in Iran, it maybe a couple thousand. So in terms of the scenario now, I'm going back to the scenario, I think the right things have been said, at least within this scenario, because perspective and understanding the development of this dynamic in the region, you have to look 10, 15 years back. We had one war in 2006 and then 3 campaigns in Gaza in 08, 2012, and just a year, 2 years ago. Now we have a different reality where it's relatively calm and quiet for the people of Israel. We managed to create a barrier between the state challenges and the actual reality, the economic reality of the state of Israel, by using a different kind of deployment of forces, acting on a different state level, and particularly cooperating with our allies and partners. So deterrence is the biggest, most important and significant factor in the overall defensive attitude of the state of Israel. We use deterrence, and it has been enormously helpful to us, and therefore the attitudes of these representatives are very logical, most particularly Israel. It brings about the Israeli superiority militarily speaking and in terms of intelligence. And if you try to learn from what has happened in the last, say, 6 years, then we have worked to stop the establishment of Iranian forces in Syria, to stop the escalation. We have worked against the tunnels, the underground and forces that Nasrallah and others have worked for over a decade. We've managed to stop ISIS to a certain degree. There was maybe a tiny Israeli contribution, and we fought terrorism day after day after day, which allows Israel to be in a kind of nice strategic situation and relatively peaceful times for our population. And of course our law enforcement and security forces have worked diligently. I think that this is a window of opportunity that we need to expand as much as possible until there is justification for actual war. And that justification can be either an actual existential threat to Israel, like in 81, and then in those 2 cases it didn't end in all-out war, but it was an existential threat at the time, or some kind of major event that really justifies an all-out war. But up until that moment, we have to do everything we can to bring about the superior advantages of the state of Israel in intelligence, in our partnerships, to maximize this window of relative calm for the people of Israel. General Petraeus. We talked about the Trump plan and all the way to security alliances. We've talked about lots of things, but do you see a situation by which the US is fighting for Israel here in the Middle East? Fighting, not defending Israel, fighting for Israel in the Middle East.
Gadi, assuming that we did not control the events and things have escalated into a broader war, the Third Lebanon War, the First Northern War, whatever name you choose. You are welcome to visit us at the gallery, by the way. And how do we end a war in our region? And what kind of result would be satisfactory for Israel? Well, when you look at the threat in the northern arena, the axis going from Iran, Iraq, Syria to Lebanon, then obviously the leader is Iran, and perhaps we need to mention Iran's super goals. Iran's super goals, there are three, and the first one is to guarantee the existence of the regime over time. The second point is to achieve regional hegemony, and that's the main effort of Qasem Soleimani. This is what he has done for 20 years, and we must admit that he did manage to truly fortify the regional control and hegemony of Iran over the Middle East, in Iraq, definitely in Lebanon, in Syria to a certain extent, and also Yemen, and also in the Gaza Strip. The third goal is to achieve a nuclear capability, or at least some kind of threshold capability that would serve as some kind of an insurance policy for Iran. And then you have the proxies, of course, first and foremost Hezbollah, and therefore every such action must promote the achieving of undermining these goals to reduce regional hegemony, to prevent nuclear capability, and in my view, to also weaken this evil regime and to reduce its motivation and its desire to achieve regional hegemony and to destroy the state of Israel. And it's a faraway country, and it's very difficult to talk about victory in Iran. And we have a certain capability and a significant advantage in our defensive capabilities. Therefore, we must establish a pattern so that at the end of the day, it will finish with a clear advantage point, and it depends on the context and the campaign, whether it's the Lebanese arena, or is it something that's also coming from Iran and from Western Iraq. The Israeli challenge in general is to reduce the campaign and to deepen as much as possible the victory. And when we look at things today from a perspective of 13 years after the Lebanon war, which wasn't so good in our criteria, we can see that the significant damage that occurred there and was concealed from the Israeli public led to 13 years of peace and quiet. But on the other hand, it did not, take away the desire and motivation of Hezbollah to gain arms and that mega operator called Qasem Soleimani. And our challenge is to advance our capabilities when tackling this threat without an all-out war. And if there is an all-out war, it must promote and accelerate a much better situation without any, and at the end of it, there won't be any Iranian forces in Syria, that the Hezbollah power has been limited and with draconian arrangements, and the control over the borders will be much greater between Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq in order to reduce the threats over Israel. General Petraeus, it's also been said here in between the lines, within the Shiite axis, the weakest link is Syria. And you also think that Bashar Assad shouldn't continue to be the president of Syria after having, after the fact that he's responsible for the murder of 500,000 people. Is there a situation in which one can understand, or perhaps the way to address the Iranian influence is by leading to the collapse of Assad's regime and not allowing him to continue and rule? Could that help and shape a better reality in our region, especially as we need to deal with the Shiite axis? about our time? Okay. It's dangerous to say that. Gabi, any final comments if you had to conclude this entire event in one sentence? What's the lesson that we draw from this event? What lesson is learned? That we're doing great? Well, we're not doing so great. The situation isn't that wonderful. There are a lot of threats. If I remember correctly, the annual situation assessments in recent years always ended with a statement that Israel's strategic balance is improved in comparison to the region. We do not detect an intention for an attack on Israel, and we heard that last night from the commander of the Intel Directorate, but the reality is volatile in five fronts and five theaters, and we can find ourselves in a quick escalation that might culminate in war, either as a result of miscalculation or a certain operation that goes awry. And still, I think that in the complex and complicated reality, the main lesson is to continue and act with determination to advance the interest of the State of Israel and to advance regional partnerships and to be in coordination with our friends, the Americans, where there is a partnership, transparency, true friendship, and common interest as a component of power of the State of Israel. And I believe that also for American interests in the Middle East, and to exert every effort in order to expand the window of quiet and normalcy for the State of Israel, to contribute to stability, and at the same time, out of our experiences, to be prepared for a war that could take place over a short schedule as a result of a tactical event, and to try and restrict and limit it, and not to reach an extensive, long-standing war, but rather to act very clearly, quickly, and professionally. Thank you very much, everyone.